Today we've arrived at proposition 11 in book 5. The first major proposition in this sequence is proposition 14, which states that the mind can bring it about that all bodily modifications or images of things may be referred to the idea of God. So Spinoza is now going to close the loop with book 1, which is concerned exclusively with his conception of God. Um, I'll assume that you have at least read the appendix to book 1, which is written in ordinary discursive language rather than the geometrical manner. To summarize things very broadly, Spinoza starts off with an abstract definition of God. What he says essentially is that God has infinitely many attributes, each of which is infinite in its own kind, and he then goes on to use an ontological argument to proves the existence and uniqueness of God, and to deduce very, well, surprising consequences, such as the principle of plenitude and necessitarianism. And he says things like God and nature are one and the same thing. In scholastic terminology, there is only one substance. Individual things are just modifications of this substance. They can't exist or be conceived without reference to this unique substance, which he calls God or nature. The material and immaterial are merely two different ways of looking at the same thing, namely God. So when, for instance, in Proposition 7 in Book 2, Spinoza says that the order and connection of ideas is the same as the order and connection of things, he's just saying that the reality has two different aspects, a material aspect and an intellectual or conscious aspect, okay, which he refers to, figuratively speaking, as the mind of God. And insofar as it applies this picture to us human beings, we humans are identical with our bodies. For Spinoza, the body and the mind are just two different ways of looking at one and the same thing. So Spinoza's God, from which all of these consequences follow, is clearly a God of the philosophers rather than a God of revealed religion. It's easy to see from the appendix to Book 1 why Spinoza was thought of almost universally as an atheist. On the other hand, it should be very clear from Spinoza's language that in his own mind, he was definitely not an atheist. And he appears to have thought that his metaphysics was just a modern, using the word modern in the sense that one talks about modern philosophy or early modern philosophy, just a modern updating of scholastic and rabbinical theology. In case it's of interest to anyone, there is a very good commentary on the ethics by Wolfson, which traces the roots of Spinoza's thought back to rabbinical, scholastic, Aristotelian roots. For Wolfson, there is not as great a break between Spinoza and his predecessors, such as Maimonides and Crescas and all the other rabbinical theologians of the medieval period. Not as great a break as most scholars, most contemporary scholars imagine. Spinoza, in his own way, appears to have been a devout theist. But clearly his conception of God is impersonal completely and does not preoccupy himself, so to speak, with merely human concerns. Yet I think the most striking aspect of Spinoza's theology is that, notwithstanding the impersonal nature of Spinoza's God, yet Spinoza appears to have had an intimate relation with God, which is to say, with reality. For God, reality, life, for Spinoza, they're all one and the same thing. So with that preamble out of the way, let's look at the first few propositions in this sequence. They're concerned with how our ideas can be organized according to what he calls the intellectual order, as distinct from the order of nature. Proposition 11 says, in proportion as a mental image is referred to more objects, so is it more frequent or more often vivid and occupies the mind more. We'll see what he's driving at here is he's talking about a mental image of God, okay? And it can be referred to all objects because for Spinoza, nothing exists or nothing can be conceived except as a mode of substance, which is to say, God. Proposition 12, the mental images of things are more easily associated with the images referred to things which we clearly and distinctly understand than with others. So once the power of reason is developed, okay, it can serve to organize the association of our ideas rather than the sort of random association which Spinoza attributes to the imagination. So he refers to his definition of reason here. This is knowledge of the second kind. He says that it arises from what he calls common notions and adequate knowledge of the properties of things and the deductions we can make from these common properties. Because they are common properties, we keep on using them all over again. So the exercise of the power of reason serves to organize the whole family of ideas which populates our mind. Proposition 13, a mental image is more often vivid in proportion as it is associated with a greater number of other images. So what he's driving at here is that the idea of God can be associated with the idea of everything else. And then proposition 14, the mind can bring it about that all bodily modifications or images of things may be referred to the idea of God. Remember that for Spinoza, the mind, the human mind, is the idea of the body. We are really indistinguishable from our bodies. So all of our ideas of God are, in fact, ideas of the body. The mind can bring it about that all bodily modifications, okay, this is the corporeal aspect of our ideas, all bodily modifications or images of things may be referred to the idea of God. Proposition 15 explains why Spinoza has spent so much time on the emotions. Okay, we can only, our ideas of God, okay, are in fact ideas of our emotions, the bodily modifications that we experience as emotions. He who clearly and distinctly understands himself and his emotions loves God, and so much the more in proportion as he more understands himself and his emotions. He who clearly and distinctly understands himself feels pleasure. Okay, just at the pleasure of understanding. And this pleasure is accompanied by the idea of God, because for Spinoza, the root of all understanding is his conception of God. Proposition 16 states that this love towards God must hold the chief place in the mind. I don't believe that this word must here is intended to be normative, but rather than it is descriptive. Okay, it must be the case that for this love, according to the proof, for this love is associated with all the modifications of the body and is fostered by them all. So he says that it's necessarily the case that the love towards God in a mind governed by reason, okay, occupies the chief place in the mind. Proposition 17 reiterates the idea that God is impersonal. God is without passions, neither is he affected by any emotion of pleasure or pain. All of God's ideas are adequate ideas, so he can't have emotions of pleasure or pain, that is, or passions. He's not excluding the possibility that God can be a source of love. We'll see that later. Again, God cannot pass either to a greater or lesser degree of perfection, okay, which is Spinoza's definition of an emotion. So, strictly speaking, God does not have any emotions because God is all that is. So here he says exactly that in the corollary. Strictly speaking, God does not love or hate anybody. God does not experience emotions of pleasure or pain, still less emotions such as anger, as in the day of wrath, the dies irae, for example. Nor does he love or hate anyone. He doesn't have any favorites. Proposition 18 says that no one can hate God. No one can, what he's saying is that no one can hate reality. Whether or not that's true, I'm not sure, but let's look at his proof. He says that the idea of God, which in us is adequate and perfect. So he's referring to these propositions in Book 2, which says that every human mind has an adequate and perfect idea of God, simply as a result of being in God, a part of God, modifications of substance. Wherefore, Insofar as we contemplate God, we are active. The idea is adequate. Consequently, there can be no pain accompanied by the idea of God. So the emotions, he says, towards God are all active emotions, and he concludes that no one can hate God. And the corollary, love towards God cannot be turned into hate. Now he forestalls an obvious objection. It may be objected that as we understand God as the cause of all things, we by that very fact regard God as the cause of pain. But I make answer that insofar as we understand the causes of pain, it to that extent ceases to be a passion because the understanding is engaged. If it ceases to be a passion, it ceases to be pain. Therefore, insofar as we understand God to be the cause of pain, we to that extent feel pleasure. So for Spinoza, this is a straightforward consequence of his system. And now we have the famous proposition 19. He who loves God cannot endeavor that God should love him in return. Now, this is the proposition which Goethe said flabbergasted him when he first encountered it after spending 6 months studying Spinoza. It appears that Goethe actually misunderstood the import of this, interpreting the cannot as a prescription rather than a description. Let's look at the proof. For if a man should so endeavor, he would desire that God whom he loves should not be God. So here he is citing proposition 19 in book 3, which states that he who conceives that the object of his love is destroyed will feel pain. So Spinoza is saying that if he wanted God to be other than he is, he would, in a sense, be destroying the object of his love. And consequently, Spinoza continues, he would desire to feel pain, which is absurd. Proposition 28 says, we endeavor to bring about whatsoever we conceive to conduce pleasure. A very striking formulation. It echoes another proposition in book 3, proposition 33, which states that when we love a thing similar to ourselves, we endeavor as far as we can to bring it about that it should love us in return. Okay, this is the ordinary experience of human love, particularly romantic love. And he says that since God is all embracing, this actually doesn't make sense. Proposition 20 states that this love towards God cannot be stained by the emotion of envy or jealousy. Contrariwise, it is the more fostered in proportion as we conceive a greater number of men to be joined to God by the same bond of love. So here he is referring to propositions in book 4. There's a proposition which states that the mind's highest good is the knowledge of God, and proposition 35, which states that insofar as men live in obedience to reason, do they always necessarily agree in nature. You may remember that this proposition plays a pivotal role in book 4, and in the course of the demonstration of that proposition, he says that men who live in obedience to reason only do such things as are necessarily good for human nature. This model of human nature, which he is holding up to us, namely the life of reason. And if they only do what's good for human nature in general, they only do what is good for individual men. So they want all individual men to rejoice in this love of God. And his Scullion then says that we can in the same way show that there is no emotion directly contrary to this love, whereby this love can be destroyed. Okay, all things are in God, all things follow from the necessity of the divine nature. And it's clear from Spinoza's writing in general that he is serious about this. Okay, that all of the vicissitudes of human life, sickness, old age, and death, all of these are embraced in this affirmation. This love towards God is the most constant of all the emotions. He now continues to give a summary of what he has said so far in the first proposition, the first 20 propositions of Book 5. He summarizes the remedies of the emotions which he has already given to us. First of all, there's the actual knowledge of the emotions. Secondly, the fact that reason is able to separate emotions from the idea of an external cause and associate an emotion with true or adequate ideas. Remember, for Spinoza, an adequate idea is an idea which contains knowledge of the cause of whatever the object of the idea is. So adequate ideas don't exist in isolation. They only exist in conjunction with other ideas in the mind. So when he talks about removing the emotion from the idea of an external cause, he is saying that we can associate the emotion with other true ideas in the mind. And this process of association is facilitated by the exercise of reason. The more we develop the power of reason over time, okay, the more we distinctly understand things in general, the the better we have an understanding of our emotional life. Okay, the propositions that we saw earlier today refer to how through the power of reason, the mind can take control over the way ideas come to be associated with each other. And there is one other thing that he covered earlier but does not mention in this list. That's the effectiveness of understanding all things as necessary. He's going to develop that, but in a different guise from proposition 20 onwards, where he talks about the eternity of the mind and the intellectual love of God, which follows from the third kind of knowledge. I'll put a reference in the comments below to a video, another that I've recorded independently of this, of the Book 5 playlist. Um, so to wrap up, let me just read some of the excerpts from this scholium. He reiterates again and again that the power of the mind is defined by knowledge only, the power of the understanding, and its infirmity or passion is defined by the privation of knowledge. It therefore follows that the mind is most passive whose greatest part is made up of inadequate ideas, so that it may be characterized more readily by its passive states than by its activities. On the other hand, that mind is most active whose greatest part is made up of adequate ideas, so that although it may contain as many inadequate ideas as the former mind, it may yet be more easily characterized by ideas attributable to human virtue than by ideas which tell of human infirmity. This part of the mind, which is constituted by adequate ideas, he will later call the eternal part of the mind. Again, it must be observed that spiritual unhealthiness and misfortunes can generally be traced to excessive love for something which is subject to many variations and which we can never become masters of. For no one is solicitous or anxious about anything unless he loves it. Neither do wrongs, suspicions, enmities, etc., arise except in regard to things whereof no one can be really master. We may thus readily conceive the power which clear and distinct knowledge, and especially that third kind of knowledge founded on the actual knowledge of God, possesses over the emotions. If it does not absolutely destroy them, insofar as they are passions, at any rate, it causes them to occupy a very small part of the mind. Further, it begets a love towards a thing immutable and eternal, whereof we may readily enter into possession. Neither can it be defiled with those faults which are inherent in ordinary love, but it may grow from strength to strength and may engross the greater part of the mind and deeply penetrate it. So he's now going to embark on the propositions concerning the eternity of the mind, the intuitive knowledge of God, the intellectual love of God. And he says that it is now therefore time to pass on to those matters which appertain to the duration of the mind without relation to the body.